It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I received the call that would change everything. The leaves were turning shades of gold and crimson, and the air was filled with the scent of impending change. My husband, Mark, had been acting strange for weeks, distant, evasive, and often lost in thought. But when he told me his parents wanted us to come over for dinner, I felt an inexplicable chill run down my spine. The Johnsons, Mark's parents, had never been particularly warm to me. They were the kind of people who smiled with their lips but not their eyes, their politeness a thin veneer over a deeper, colder demeanor. I hesitated but agreed, hoping to mend the growing rift between us. Mark had been increasingly distant, and I thought maybe a family dinner could help bridge the gap. As we drove to their house, the silence in the car was deafening. Mark was unusually quiet, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I tried to make small talk, asking about his day and if there was anything special his parents had planned. His responses were clipped and distracted, as if his mind was elsewhere. I felt a growing sense of unease but pushed it aside, attributing it to my own anxiety. When we arrived, the house was eerily quiet. The Johnsons greeted us with forced smiles, their eyes darting around nervously. I felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter, but I shook off the feeling and followed them inside. The house was immaculate, as always, with every piece of furniture in its place and not a speck of dust in sight. Dinner was a tense affair. The conversation was stilted, and the air was thick with unspoken tension. Midway through the meal, Mark's father, Mr. Johnson, cleared his throat and said, "We have something important to discuss with you both." My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at Mark, but he avoided my gaze, his jaw clenched. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a strange intensity. "We've been thinking," she began, "about the future of this house. It's been in our family for generations, and we want to ensure it stays that way." My mind raced. What did this have to do with us? Before I could ask, she continued, "We've decided to transfer the house to you, Isabella." I was stunned. This was the last thing I expected. The Johnsons had always been possessive of their property, and I couldn't fathom why they would suddenly want to give it to me. I looked at Mark, hoping for some explanation, but he just nodded, a strange smile playing on his lips. As the evening wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The Johnsons' behavior was too calculated, too rehearsed. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanging knowing glances, and I felt like an outsider in their little conspiracy. I tried to engage Mark in conversation, but he was distant, his mind clearly elsewhere. When we finally left, I confronted him in the car. "What was that all about?" I asked, my voice tinged with suspicion. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's complicated," he said. "They just want to ensure the house stays in the family, and since we're married, it makes sense for it to go to you." His explanation seemed logical, but something still didn't sit right with me. I decided to let it go for now, but I resolved to keep a closer eye on the situation. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The Johnsons insisted on handling all the paperwork, and Mark seemed more than happy to let them take the lead. I tried to stay involved, but they kept me at arm's length, citing legal technicalities. I felt like a spectator in my own life, watching as events unfolded without my input. One evening, as I was going through some old family photos, I stumbled upon a document that made my blood run cold. It was a letter from a lawyer, detailing a clause in the house's deed that allowed the Johnsons to reclaim the property under certain circumstances. My heart pounded as I read the words. "In the event of marital discord, the house shall revert to the original owners." My mind raced. Was this why they were so eager to transfer the house to me? Did they know something I didn't? I felt a knot form in my stomach. I had always suspected that Mark's parents were manipulative, but this was something else entirely. I decided to confront Mark again, but he dismissed my concerns, saying I was overreacting. "They're just being cautious," he said. "It's nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being set up. I started to notice little things. Mark's late nights at the office, the Johnsons' frequent visits, the way they looked at me with thinly veiled contempt. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, caught in a web of deceit and manipulation. As the days passed, my suspicions grew. Mark's behavior became increasingly erratic, and the Johnsons were constantly dropping by unannounced. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation between Mark and his mother that made my heart sink. "We need to speed things up," Mrs. Johnson hissed. "She's starting to ask too many questions." Mark's response was muffled, but I caught the words divorce and house. My blood ran cold. Was this their plan all along? To use the house as leverage to force a divorce? I felt betrayed and foolish for not seeing it sooner. I confronted Mark, demanding the truth. He finally admitted that his parents had been pressuring him to divorce me and reclaim the house. "They think you're not good enough for me," he said, his voice tinged with shame. "They want me to marry someone more suitable." I was devastated. The man I loved had been lying to me, and his parents were pulling the strings. I felt like a pawn in their little game, and I was determined to fight back. I decided it was time to take matters into my own hands. I contacted a lawyer and explained the situation. He advised me to gather as much evidence as possible. I started documenting every interaction with the Johnsons, every strange look, every veiled threat. One evening, I confronted Mark and his parents. "I know what you're trying to do," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "You're using the house to force me out." The Johnsons exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. Mark sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not like that," he said. "We just want to protect our family's legacy." But his words rang hollow. I could see the guilt in his eyes. The tension in the room was palpable. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. "If you want the house so badly, why not just say so?" I challenged. "Why go through all this deception?" Mrs. Johnson finally broke the silence. "Because you don't deserve it," she spat. "You never did." Her words cut deep, but they also clarified everything. This wasn't about the house. It was about control. With the help of my lawyer, I gathered enough evidence to prove the Johnson scheme. The court ruled in my favor, and the house was rightfully mine. Mark and his parents were forced to back down, their plan thwarted. In the aftermath, I decided to sell the house. It held too many painful memories, and I wanted to start fresh. As I packed my things, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I had reclaimed my life, and nothing could take that away from me. A few months later, I moved into a cozy little house on the other side of town. It wasn't as grand as the Johnsons' house, but it was mine. I had learned a valuable lesson about trust and betrayal, and I was determined to move forward with my life. Mark and I eventually divorced, and I found solace in the knowledge that I had stood up for myself. The Johnsons' attempts to control me had backfired, and I was finally free. Looking back, I realized that the house was never just a building. It was a symbol of the power struggle that had defined my marriage. But now, as I sit on my porch watching the sunset, I feel a sense of peace. I have rebuilt my life, and I am stronger for it. The Johnsons' house may have been a house of shadows, but my new home is a house of light. And that makes all the difference. In the years that followed, I found happiness in the simple things. Mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, evenings filled with the laughter of friends, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had survived. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, and even started volunteering at a local shelter. Mark tried to reach out to me several times, but I kept my distance. I had forgiven him, but I knew that our relationship was beyond repair. I wished him well, but I had no desire to revisit the past. As time passed, I learned to let go of the anger and resentment that had once consumed me. I realized that holding on to those feelings was only hurting me, and I was determined to find peace. I started meditating, practicing yoga, and focusing on my own well-being. Eventually, I met someone new, a kind, gentle man who loved me for who I was. We built a life together, filled with love and laughter. And through it all, I never forgot the lessons I learned from the House of Shadows.